So now we're beginning the second topic in the course, social psychology, in preparation for you to take quiz number 2 online. To a large extent, you're going to need to rely on your textbook as you prepare for the second quiz, because we're going to be focusing on some subtopics in the field of social psychology. Still, I want you to have an overview of this field, and I'm going to do my best to help you study effectively. I'm going to begin by describing one of the most famous and most controversial experiments in the history of psychology, research conducted by Stanley Milgram, published in the 1960s. You've been exposed to the ethics of conducting research, the guidelines published by the American Psychological Association, but why do we have those? Why is it important to protect participants in psychological research? And this traces back to some of the social psychological research conducted in the U.S. in the 1960s and 1970s. And that includes Milgram's obedience to authority experiments. And here's how Milgram conducted his research. He put advertisements in local newspapers requesting participants and offering to pay them a small amount of money. Participants were assessed to make sure that they were just ordinary people from all different walks of life, and appointments were made for each individual to come one at a time to Yale University, where Milgram was conducting his research. Here's what would happen if you were a participant in Milgram's study. You would knock on the door of the laboratory at Yale University. You would be greeted by a man in a white lab coat. You would be brought into the laboratory and introduced to another man, this kind of mild-mannered, nice man, and you would be told that he is also a participant in this research. But that was deception. That nice, mild-mannered man was actually a confederate of the experimenter, an actor, hired to play a particular role. As the real participant, you would be told that the experiment involved the effects of punishment on learning. And you would be told that one of you would be the teacher and the other would be the learner in this experiment, and that you would be randomly assigned to those roles. This too was deception. It was rigged so that the real participant was always the teacher and the confederate, the actor, was always the learner. Then you would be taken further back into the laboratory, where you'd be shown the confederate, or learner, being strapped into a chair and electrodes placed on his body. And you would be told that the learner would be learning a set of word pairs, and that as the teacher, you would be in another room and you would be using punishment to help him learn. An electrode would be placed on your body and you would be given a mild electric shock just to show you that the instruments actually worked. Now, this was the only electric shock actually administered in this entire experiment, and it was done in order to convince you that this in fact was the research design. As you're leaving the room with that nice man strapped in the chair and electrodes on his body, he says, "Well, I have a heart condition. Is this okay for me to do?" And the researcher assures him that it would be fine. Then as the real research participant, the teacher, you're taken into another room where you're asked to sit at a table, and there's this very impressive looking console on the table. It's actually a big box and it has many levers, and those levers have labels. And those labels include voltages of electric shock, 15 volts, 30 volts, all the way up to 450 volts by 15-volt increments. There are also words on those labels: mild shock, moderate shock, severe shock, all the way up to 450 volts that was just labeled in red letters XXX. As the real participant, the teacher, you're told that you're going to be communicating with the man in the next room, the confederate, over an intercom system, and that you'll be testing him on these word pairs, and every time that he makes a mistake, you are to administer punishment by pressing one of the levers and administering electric shock. And for each error that the man makes, you're to increase the amount of shock that you deliver. Deception. What you don't know as the real participant is that you're actually listening to pre-recorded audio tapes of the man's communications. and that the errors that he would be making are at preset intervals. So the experiment begins. You test the man on the word pairs, apparently talking to him over the intercom, and when he makes errors, you press the lever to give him punishment in the form of electric shock, supposedly, and the man begins to complain that it hurts. And presuming the participant continues in the experiment, later on he begins screaming in pain and begging to be let out of the experiment. And ultimately, he goes silent. And the researcher who's standing by the real participant is just saying things like, "Please continue, the research must go on," and telling the real participant to treat the absence of an answer as an incorrect answer and to continue delivering those shocks. Later on in this PowerPoint presentation, you'll have the opportunity to actually watch historical footage of the Milgram study. The behavior of the participants would not suggest that they were sadists or that they were people who generally enjoyed hurting other people or administering punishment that is potentially deadly. They, in fact, were very upset and stressed by participation in this research. They were begging the researcher not to make them have to do it. They were squirming in their seats. They were perspiring heavily. They were digging their fingernails into the palms of their hands as they clenched their fists. They begged not to have to do this, and the researcher would say, "Please continue, the research must go on." And I want you, if you're not already familiar with Milgram, to guess how many people you think would participate in this research all the way to the end, to administering or thinking they're administering an electric shock that is deadly to another person with a heart condition. Very nice man. 2/3. About 2/3 of people went all the way to the end in the Milgram study, suggesting that we have an explanation of why people behave in absolutely horrible ways to other people in certain circumstances. Milgram described this as obedience to authority. That man in a white lab coat at Yale University was an authority figure. And so perhaps we have an understanding of how genocide occurs or how the events of the Holocaust occurred. Perfectly nice people can do horrible things to other people just because they're told to do so by an authority figure. The results of the Milgram study was shocking both to scientists, psychologists, and lay people. And it was much criticized. Some people suggested that it was unethical, that not only are you causing the participants to experience extreme distress, physical distress, you're forcing them to learn something about themselves that nobody wants to know about. The fact that they, just because they're told by somebody else, wearing a lab coat, to harm or kill another person, an innocent person. There was a public uproar about the Milgram study and other social psychological research studies of the time, and so that is why the American Psychological Association set out to provide guidelines for the ethical conduct of research, and you've learned those guidelines now. Milgram actually conducted multiple experiments. He showed that there was no particular difference, no significant difference between males and females who participated in this study. He also manipulated variables such as proximity to the learner in order to investigate the factors that would increase or decrease the likelihood that someone would behave in this fashion to another person. For instance, in some of his studies, Milgram actually had the teacher and the learner sitting side by side. And instead of pressing a lever to administer the so-called shock, the research participant actually had to pick up the hand of the learner and place it on a metal plate to administer the so-called shock. How many people do you think would do this? That they would go all the way to the end with apparently deadly levels of shock when the person they're punishing is right next to them? Go on to the next slide and you'll find out. Are you surprised by these results? I personally find them quite shocking. But it certainly does provide something of an explanation of why people behave atrociously to other people under certain circumstances. And what we learned from the Milgram study was that the situation is important. It's not that all of these participants were sadists or they had sadistic personalities. We don't look for explanations of behavior here by considering personalities. Instead, we look at the social pressure that they experienced in the situation. And the implication is that any one of us could behave this way if we are in a situation that applies this type of pressure. Stanley Milgram also conducted an experiment where he would have other individuals in the room during the obedience to authority experiment, and he described them as role models of defiance. These were individuals who refused. They were confederates of the experimenter. They were actors, but in front of the real participant, they refused to administer the shocks so that somebody in the other room would be harmed or even killed. And it turns out that that substantially reduces the number of people who went all the way to the end in this experiment. That if we have role models of defiance, then we're less apt to behave in unethical ways just because we're told to do so by an authority figure. Personally, I think that the Milgram study is one of the most important topics that I ever teach in a general psychology class. It taught us a great deal about what it means to be human, and there have been times in my own life when I have thought back to the Milgram study because I believed that an authority figure was trying to convince me to behave in some way that I thought was unethical. On the next PowerPoint slide, I've provided a link to a YouTube video that actually shows you historical footage of the Milgram experiment. It's tough to watch, and I want to warn you that there are some graphic images from the Holocaust as Philip Zimbardo and Stanley Milgram explain why this research was conducted. Speaking of Philip Zimbardo, a very famous psychologist, I want to mention another study that you should read about in your textbook. It's called the Stanford prison experiment. It was conducted by Philip Zimbardo. And this was another one of these social psychological experiments from decades ago that was very controversial. In the Stanford prison experiment, Philip Zimbardo recruited college students to participate in this experiment, and it was a simulation of a prison environment. He randomly selected participants to serve as correction officers and others to actually be the prisoners. And he had the prisoners arrested at their homes in this simulation by real police officers, taken to the basement at Stanford University, where they were placed in prison cells. He told the correction officers, the students in those roles, to just maintain law and order. It turns out that the experiment had to be ended early because of the cruelty of the correction officers, that they were brutal and arbitrarily punishing the prisoners. And again, these were individuals who were assessed to make sure that they were psychologically healthy, they were not thought to have sadistic personalities. But again, the situation is very powerful, and one's social role can be very powerful in influencing behavior. So you'll be reading about that in your textbook, and if you're interested, you can always Google the Stanford prison experiment and watch some historical footage of it. But let's talk for a moment about how you're going to study for quiz number 2. You're basically going to learn about various important social psychological concepts. Your study aids and vocabulary terms will help you identify what those are. You'll be reading about classic social psychological studies in your textbook regarding the Asch effect or conformity, studies conducted by Solomon Asch, as well as Milgram studies and Zimbardo's prison experiment. And the way I described the Milgram study to you was in quite a bit of detail. And so as you study this social psychological information from your textbook, as you read about these classic studies, important psychological vocabulary terms, I want you to learn about how the research was conducted, what were the procedures, and very important, understand why the research was important. Maybe controversial, but did we learn something important about human behavior?